Welcome to Concerning the Spiritual in Art, a podcast exploring spirituality, consciousness, and the creative process. I'm your host, Martin Benson. All right, y'all, welcome back to the podcast. I have an immensely special episode for you today with Barbara Braathen. Barbara is a former art curator, dealer, and gallerist from New York City for many decades and has always been a huge champion for the spiritual in art. And our conversation today will not disappoint. We not only talk about Barbara's sort of upbringing and sort of how she began her interest in spirituality and in the spiritual in art, but also how her time in New York sort of showed her that the sort of art world wasn't ready to talk about spirituality in relation to art for a long time, but how she's seeing that change dramatically today and how much that excites her. We talk a lot about just spirituality in general, spiritual practice, and how spirituality and art go hand in hand with each other. She has such incredible insight, not only around the history of these sort of movements within art, but also insight about the landscape of the art world itself. So I think there's just so much to sort of glean from this discussion. I think y'all are going to enjoy it a lot. Barbara is just amazing and such a wonderful spirit to connect with in this way. And I'm super excited to share this episode with all of you. So here you go, Barbara Braathen. All right, Barbara, welcome to the podcast. How's it going over there?
It's pretty good, Martin. It's spring in Florida and it is gorgeous.
I know the spring is popping here in New Orleans. Oh yeah. I've been like paying attention to the different sounds of the birds. I can tell the birds are coming back. You know what I mean? It's a beautiful time where we're at.
It really is, right. We have cardinals and they pair for life in the yard. So we have a pair of cardinals. We've had peacocks come in, a herd or flock, whatever they call it. Yeah. Just all kinds of birds. We have a stream, so we've got a lot of river birds and
That's kind of how it is here in New Orleans too, with sort of like the wetlands and stuff. But yeah, I'm just on this beautiful sort of burgeoning spring day. We get to be together and talk about things that we are both incredibly passionate about, which is the spiritual and art.
My favorite subject, right?
Me too. So we find ourselves in good company. And I'm just so grateful that I got connected to you through Katie Pilgrim at Lifted Lab. She pointed me in your direction, and as she does with lots of other artists. And just when we talked on the phone initially, like it was just like kindred spirits, like we were just on the same page about all of this. And so I think a good way for us to begin our episode together is to kind of talk a little about you and sort of your origins and sort of how you got into not only making art, but showing art. You're a gallerist in New York for many years, and you've been heavily invested in not only contemporary art, but also the spiritual in art. And I'm just curious sort of like how that all sort of began for you.
Okay. Well, I was born in North Dakota and grew up there. And of course, the sophisticated art world didn't exist at that time, right? But I was an artist from the time I was a little kid. And an artist at that time was determined by the fact that you could draw, right? So that was my mindset always. I was identified as the artist, you know. And I lucked out by having a fantastic art teacher from the time I was 10 years old until I graduated from high school, named Robert Moore. And he was a flamboyant individual who liked to wear white suits and red rhinestone jewelry, right? And he had everyone making art for 50 miles around from 3 years old to 100, you know.
Wow.
And we went to, a couple of us, of his students, went to my first museum experience was in Winnipeg. We were about 100 miles from the border of Canada.
Okay.
And we went to an exhibition, it was probably about 1961, to a Van Gogh show.
Oh, wow.
I still remember the paintings, and these were really the first paintings I'd ever seen,
Man.
right? Just the sculpture of the surface, you know, and the radiant light like beaming into your eyes. It was just, as well as the sort of beautiful style of the ladies in Winnipeg, because they were kind of French influenced, and it was marvelous, that experience.
Wow.
So anyway, then I briefly went to the University of North Dakota and also had some very good experiences there art-wise. It was when we first drew from the model, right? The model comes in and sheds.
Oh, yeah.
While going, ah! And it was really great. And I don't know if they teach model drawing anymore, but we would do the teacher would have us do things. He was a great teacher. Like the model had to change every 30 seconds and you had to draw.
Oh, yeah.
And so you really get into, anyway.
Yeah, the gesture drawing. I love that. I mean, when I didn't get to draw from a model until I was in college and undergrad. And it is an amazing experience. Once you get over the fact, like, oh, they're naked bodies and stuff, like,
right.
It's just form and line and shape, okay. You know, like value. Okay. It's beautiful.
Well, I'm pleased to hear that you did draw from the model. So, because I don't know if they still do that I don't know. I have no idea what they do.
Yeah, I think they do in more university settings. Like in high school, they're not doing that. It's problematic probably to bring in some person from outside to strip naked for high school students, you know. But in college, I would assume in a lot of programs, they're still doing it because it is such a beautiful way to begin to see the human body in a new way, but also to develop some confidence in your mark and all of that. So you were studying at North Dakota University?
Right. And then in 1964, I went to UCLA. I wanted to go to a warmer climate. I knew nothing, right?
Wow.
Bye.
Yep, exactly. Across the country.
Just in the middle of the Cultural Revolution.
Yeah, I was going to say timing. Wow.
At that moment, right?
Wow.
So that was just a fantastic experience. And I spent 9 years there. I got my doctoral candidacy, but I shifted eventually. About a year I was doing art courses, but I shifted into art history.
Cool.
Yeah.
What caused you to shift? Like, was there anything you can remember that kind of pushed you more toward art history as opposed to from the studio art practices?
Yeah, I think I was lazy.
I don't know. Studying art history is pretty rigorous, especially I can imagine at UCLA.
Well, I kind of backed into art history because my interest was contemporary art. I mean, that was the involvement. But I liked thinking, you know, and I mean, I still make art.
Great.
But I just didn't want the materials that it was thinking was so simple. and my friends were pretty much creatives, you know, they were artists. And so the discussion was always about art and going to museums together, going to all the galleries. And it was a phenomenal education. I mean, I did study, of course, the classics. You know, there was a library at UCLA called the Belt Library of Vinciana, and it duplicated Leonardo da Vinci's library, plus every book ever on Leonardo.
Wow.
And the professor, Dr. Pedretti, was a Leonardo specialist. And what I learned there was detail, the fine detail of, you know, like we had an assignment that to look through Leonardo's codexes for anything on jumping. That was what I had to do.
Oh, wow.
Looking through all these little diagrams. Oh, here's something on jumping. Oh, here's something. Right. You put it together. And Pedretti, who you could barely understand his English, right, just was ecstatic with these things, right? On, whatever. So there was a marvelous education on art history.
Yeah.
My focus was always contemporary.
Yes.
And at 4:00 in the morning, when everybody would stop hanging out, right, it was decided that I should be a dealer and have a gallery, right?
All your friends like, all right, you're gonna set up the gallery.
Exactly. I've got that assignment, right?
Oh, wow.
So that's kind of how that happened.
Interesting. That's really interesting how like you kind of really connected with your intellectual curiosity and how that sort of drove you into study art history. I mean, studying Da Vinci, I mean, it's probably so incredibly enlightening because there's still so much mystery around him and what he knew and what he was really talking about, especially his use in geometry and symbolism. He was definitely an enlightened cat, that's for sure.
So enlightened.
Yes, it's unbelievable.
Amazing.
Like a polymath is sort of how you would describe him. I mean, he just could do everything. He was an intellect. He had intellectual prowess unlike anyone else his age. He was making art in the most exquisite capacity with the level of detail and quality of rendering. But then he was also studying metaphysics and the ancient Greek philosophy. I mean, he was just talk about like he was the Renaissance in some ways in terms of an embodiment of it.
Yeah, completely. And there was an article recently on that Leonardo may have conceived of E = mc square.
Really?
And there is some kind of marginal details that somebody's picked up and said, oh, related.
I would not be surprised. I mean, all we can know of him is all the sketches and writings he left behind and anecdotes and stories from others around that time period. But we all know that doesn't really summarize a full person and what their capacities actually were. So I would not be surprised if he figured that one out before Einstein himself. Who knows?
I mean, he worked on airplanes and he
yes,
like everything.
I know. So, yeah, it's incredible. And so your friends seemed like to be the real catalyst for you to kind of plant that seed. Like, all right, you're gonna go start the gallery. You're gonna go deal the art. Then how did you go from there?
Let's see here. I left LA in 73 and I taught for 2 years at Michigan State University, modern art.
Okay.
And then I went to New York, and I always knew I was going to go to New York because that was the head, center of the art world.
Yeah.
Right? And I'm thrilled now to see Los Angeles pretty much bubbling up as an equal center.
Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Especially in the past couple decades. You've seen LA because a lot of amazing movements came out of Los Angeles, like the light and space movement that happened like in the 70s. So there's a lot of amazing things that happen on the West Coast, but New York still seems to be kind of like, it's just got this like gravitational field to it. It just sucks everybody to it.
Yeah, it's that place. I don't know now how young artists are surviving. When I went to New York, hey, I mean, it was a set time when the president, who I guess was Ford, told New York to drop dead when it was going into debt. That was 1975.
Oh my gosh.
And it was pretty bummed out. Nobody lived in Lower Manhattan, and the Lower East Side was, you could squat in a building. I know a number of people who squatted and obtained buildings.
Wow.
I knew two artists, a Danish woman and an Italian sculptor, both of whom unfortunately died of AIDS.
Oh.
but they wonderful artists, lived in a building with no roof.
Oh my gosh.
It's like,
How do you do that in the dead of winter in New York City? I mean, it's crazy.
this is, artists are very creative.
Yes, they are. Exactly. And resilient. That's
Yeah,
for sure.
yeah. Well, the thing about the spiritual in art, it's like in Los Angeles in the 60s, I really see a resurgence of Europe before World War I in terms of spiritual and art.
Interesting.
I didn't separate art and spirituality. To me, they were the same.
I feel the same way.
Yeah. So when I got to New York, it didn't take me long to realize you don't even talk about it. You don't bring it up.
Mm-hmm.
You don't even bring it up. And that was tough because that was the gas in my tank. I mean, that's what I wanted to work with was, the art and spirituality.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Why do you think that was? Like, what do you think caused this sort of bifurcation between art and spirituality? Like, do you have any insight or even just like maybe an intuition about what might have severed that relationship for people at that time? It's probably a very complex
number
issue.
one, no, it's something I've thought about my whole life. It's like we live in a very materialistic age.
Mm-hmm.
Can't see spirit, therefore it doesn't exist, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when you trace the trajectory of the spiritual in art, it's like I came across an interesting factoid. I've studied pretty deeply about Kandinsky and his life. And he had to go to Russia at the outbreak of World War I, 1914, and he was there for about 7 years. 7 years. So when the Tsar, and when he wrote that book concerning the spiritual in art, which came out at the end of 1911, it was an instant global hit. Everyone read that book. Duchamp went to Munich and spent 3 months just so he could immerse himself in that atmosphere.
Wow.
And there's a copy of Concerning the Spiritual in Art of Duchamp's with notes.
Really?
Yeah. So artists were, and Duchamp was an occultist. I mean, yeah. And then the war happened. Dada. It was pretty bad. Kandinsky was discriminated against for being too soft, too tender, because what was kicking in was the machine age, and communism was very much anti-spiritual. I mean, you kind of like, and when the Tsar was assassinated, I'm sorry, not assassinated, when the 300-year rule of the Tsar ended in 1917, that was February. Apparently, there was an American there who was reporting and saying immediately you could not any longer talk about spirituality.
Wow.
It was machine, it was materialism, it was progress, it was advanced, it was a new age. It was, and that was a throwback to something else. So you see in the 20s, the machine age, manifesting.
Yeah.
And in the 30s was a very socialist, communist kind of time, and, people's thinking. And you kind of trace it, like there's a letter that Albers wrote to Kandinsky in 1939, and he said he was very close talking to Diego Rivera, who said to him, don't mention that word. Do not mention spirituality. So, then we get into the 40s, that's the war, and into the 40s, the 50s, abstract expressionism. They were still at least able to acknowledge the sublime, right?
Yes. Yeah, there we go. That's how we talk about it now.
And your emotion. And like Barnett Newman did those amazing paintings on the Stations of the Cross. And I mean, any Newman painting you stand in front of, you just are full of awe. But well, then came minimal art, pop, which is jokes and satire, and then minimal, and which was my thesis, by the way. My doctoral dissertation was on minimal.
Wow. So like Donald Judd and that camp.
Yes. Yes. And it's funny because it's the two extreme poles.
Right.
There's what you see is what you get, and no metaphor, no deeper meaning, is just exactly what you see.
Yes.
And the other side, which is the luminosity of the spirit.
Yeah.
And some artists were still there, but Judd was very, clear about his thinking and his approach. So I think it was the 60s where you couldn't, well, already in 1939, Albers was expressing that you couldn't talk about it. So by the 60s, it really took hold. And it kind of, you sort of, I mean, there was here and there, I pulled some books, like there was the 1985 exhibition, right, at the LA County Museum. And people asked Maurice Tuckman a couple years later, who was the curator of that show, what effect did it have? He said, absolute none, nothing, no effect whatsoever. Because again, it was just a subject you couldn't talk about. And in fact, you really couldn't talk about it much, except a little appearance here and there, until Hilma af Klint.
Yes.
That opened the gates to at least be discussed.
Exactly. To begin to see that this work has power, this work has relevance. Yeah. And it's interesting because Hilma was making this work even before Kandinsky, at least according to what we know about the records of her work. Totally. So that's kind of interesting as well, right? That she was making this work, because Kandinsky's sort of known as like the person who made the first like purely abstract painting, as far as we can tell in the Western canon, but that's not the case. And that reminds me that we don't know anything. We can make any kind of claims, and something's always going to come out of the woodwork and just put it on its head. But that was a moment for sure. And I've actually talked to a few other artists on this podcast. We've all pointed to that moment at that Guggenheim show as being a very sort of like pivotal door opening for this conversation to happen, because it really kind of went underground. The conversation was still happening, but it's not happening in the upper echelons of the power structures within the art world, the curators, the museums, the big time galleries, the big time collectors, the auction houses. It was sort of like not addressed in a way that wasn't. And everything, I feel, always happens for some peculiar reason that we can't understand. But we find ourselves here in 2021 or 23. What year is it? 23, telling you. Yeah. That I was thinking the 21st century, like we find ourselves here, like bringing this back up again. And I find it kind of interesting that like during the Cultural Revolution of like the 60s and the 70s, where people were engaging in spirituality, spiritual practice, not only through like psychedelic culture, but a lot of the Eastern wisdom traditions were flooding into the West. Gurus everywhere you looked, right? So people were definitely deeply interested in it, but there was some level of society that seemed to shut that out. And so it kind of like really seeped into the underground in the 80s and the 90s. But we're seeing a resurgence of all that again, with spiritual practices, people getting engaged in meditation and yoga, interested in metaphysics, interested in the occult or in astrology, all of these things. So it's kind of amazing to me to see it all come together. And art is always such an important sort of torch to lead these movements. I think art has a really important role to play.
Art has, I think, I mean, we know that our culture is having issues.
Mm-hmm.
And when I look at the movement of art and the acceptance of visual art from the time I became conscious until now, it's pretty remarkable. Art has become accepted, and it was not basically, much like in the 60s. The art world was tiny.
Yeah.
Very, very, very small. You knew everybody pretty much around the world. You know who they were because you read the same magazines every single month. You read everything, and now the art world's gotten so immense that there's just no, but
exactly, with the internet and social media.
But what I've noticed, like, since a lot of the talking heads on television is something, the newscasting, they have art behind them. This is amazing. They all do.
Yeah.
And art is, to me, whether it's music or dance or visual art, which is the most difficult to penetrate, I think, or poetry or whatever, is so important in our culture.
Yeah.
When the church has kind of lost its pizzazz, art is there and always will give you that lift. That is what it's about, is to give you a lift, and to open your minds and eyes and heart.
Yes. That's how I feel about it too.
So important.
And I think it can do so many things. Like on one level, like art can be such an incredible way of engaging in dialogue, asking really important questions and getting people to engage their intellect and talk about sort of intellectual frameworks of culture and society and identity. And those are really important things to discuss. But also, I feel art can be sort of like a transcendent experience or a catalyst for like a new novel experience of one's own consciousness. And so, like, because I think the intellect is a very important tool that we have within our being, this whole mind, body system, spirit that we have, but it's not the whole game. And I see you can see a lot of art. Maybe that's sort of what kind of happened also in the 70s and 80s and 90s, is that art got sort of co-opted by this hyper intellectual framework. And so it was all about like intellect and logic and rationality in some ways. And anything that sort of defied that was a little trickier for people to handle. And therefore it was not as considered. I'm not sure, I'm speculating, but that's my feelings on it. Is some things in life are just not able to be explained through words. Only through feelings and experiences.
Absolutely. And in meditative experiences, I mean, a lot of times, like just art imagery is so inventive and often beautiful, and to ponder on art, I mean, it's quite remarkable. I wanted to mention this book here, The Spiritual Dynamic in Modern Art, just by Christine Spretnick, who is a philosophy teacher and in some institution. And the fascinating thing about that book, which I should have read long ago, it was published in 2014, is that it's not the artists that suppressed the spiritual in art. It was everything around it. It was the dealers, the collectors, the critics, the curators. They're the ones who didn't want to talk about it.
I know.
But the artists kind of, I mean, art is some form of channeling.
Yes.
When you sit down there, I mean, you're putting all everything that you know and believe and feel into your work. But if you have a little problem, you just you can ask and you get a little channeling help.
Yeah,
Right?
yes.
So artists are close to the spiritual
Mm-hmm.
in creation. There's just, way.
Yeah.
So it's all that superstructure around art that prevented that breathing aspect of it to be more pondered.
Yes. That makes a lot of sense. And I wonder, like, those structures, because when we look at, if we take a real critical look at the sort of structures of the art world, quote unquote, and the hierarchies of those power structures, there's so much money involved. And so when there's so much money involved in it, there's going to be sort of like very strong influence coming from players who have the most money in a lot of sense, like, because they're the ones funding the museums, they're the ones who are buying the work and collecting and paying for the gallerists. And so in a way, it's almost like money has corrupted those systems in some way. And I think this is a conversation we're having largely in the culture now, is about the influence of corporation on institution, on government, and how these big money players are really negatively impacting our social structures and our cultural structures. And I think the same could be said for those structures within the art world as well. At least those are the parallels that I draw when I really think about it.
Well, Picasso complained about it. Duchamp complained about it. They all complained about the infiltration of big money. But, it's always been there. It's always going to be there.
Yeah.
I'm looking at the art market as a separate sphere. And it's a game. It's fun to play.
Yeah.
It's fun to play.
Yeah.
And that's a game that I wish I could play, but I can't.
Right.
But
to your point about like how artists are innately close to the spiritual just through the virtue of creative process. Like, the act of creation itself is such a miraculous endeavor that the human species takes part in, compared to the animal kingdom. Now, you could make the argument, like the way birds nest, the way they create their nests, or the way that spiders weave webs. Those are beautiful works of art in and of themselves. But what humans do is another layer of intention and sort of self-awareness that I think creates this powerful connection to the creative forces of the universe. And so by virtue of engaging in a creative act, you are aligning yourself with these principles of creation itself, which is a mysterious origin for all of us. No one can say for sure where this all came from. We have like our own personal experiences and connections to that. But so I totally agree with your point that, like, artists themselves, this was still probably happening in their conversations, but it was the superstructure, like you said, around it that sort of limited it from getting out to more of like a larger level of conversation, so to speak.
Right. And what I think is needed now, which is why I think your podcast is very valuable, is vocabulary just to discuss the spiritual in art, and vocabulary to discuss the spiritual, because the spiritual is pretty mysterious, and ever more so than now that we don't have our religious superstructure kind of. I have to mention an experience I had, which just blew my mind.
Yes, please.
My friend Anne McCoy, who's a very interesting artist and very spiritually oriented, goes to a Russian Orthodox church in Manhattan. And I went with her one time, and I had asked her beforehand, well, how long is the service? And she said, oh, about 3 hours. I said, 3 hours? I don't know if I can say this. She says, don't worry, it goes by really fast. It was walking into a miracle or something. I mean, the color, the move, there were, I don't know, 20 priests with their robes and their scepters and their deaths, and everybody stood up. and the room is just surrounded by icons and candles, and there's a choir in the corner singing like angels, and you are transported. This is a service that hasn't changed since 354 AD.
Wow.
It is the same.
Same ritual.
It was phenomenal. Phenomenal. And of course, that was Kandinsky's service. You know, I would just love to go to some of these churches in I don't know, Russia, Ukraine, whatever.
They're Eastern Europe, the Orthodox.
Phenomenal.
Yeah.
And that was a very transportive experience. And that's sort of what church used to be like.
Right.
You know, to really move us. You know,
and point to these like magical spaces beyond like the everyday quote unquote mundane experience. It's supposed to like envelop your senses, like through the various aromas, the colors, the garbs that they're wearing, like you're describing, even the movement of the body, right, through the ritual acts. And I find personally like ritual to be such a powerful tool for us to get into different states of consciousness beyond sort of the everyday waking consciousness that we might be used to. And I think a lot of religious institutions understood this. And that's why you see within all kinds of religion, this importance of ritual and ceremony and the pageantry that can surround it. And that's so cool that you were able to go with her and that you're able to like be open enough to the experience to really see what it was, like what was happening. Because I could imagine some people going like, oh my God, 3 hours in this church, like, and then just the judging mind kind of.
Well, that's how I went in,
you
know, but you forgot time. It was timeless. It was out of.
And like, to your point also about like how now in this sort of contemporary culture, we're seeing, I mean, there's still definitely a swatch of society who is very religious and aligned with like more traditional or orthodox religious practices. But when you look at, I would say, a larger swatch of society, most are a little disenfranchised from their religious origins.
Oh, totally.
And they're looking for some kind of framework to have these kinds of experiences, to engage in the power of ritual, to have something that points their consciousness beyond maybe the rat race of modern material society. And so the seeking mind is emerging, I think, in the mainstream. And that's where I think a lot of the spiritual practices of the East are really attractive to a lot of people, because it's something very practical you can do in terms of like meditation or even like yoga asana, moving your body or breath work and things like that. But I feel like there is this longing that I sense, and I'm biased because I'm in this world. Like I've been deeply discovering myself through spiritual practice for many, many years. But I see that there is this feeling of longing in a lot of people for some kind of tangible way to connect with this fundamental, mysterious component to one's reality. And I think art is definitely a way of facilitating that as well, even though it's not necessarily in a religious context. The work that I personally am interested in and that I explore as an artist myself is finding a way to look at the symbolism and geometries and even the mathematics of sort of various forms in nature and how that's pointing to this sense of God or creator or spirit or intelligence that really runs the show. And bringing that into my work as a way of sort of like honoring, but also learning about how these things work. I think you can't understand them unless you're actually applying them in some way. So we're in an interesting time where I feel like we are ripe. We are ripe for transcendence.
Right. Well, that's like the Hilma af Klint show was the biggest attendance they've ever had.
Amazing. What does that tell you?
What does it tell you? People want to know how to go. What is the spirit? Where do you go? How do you find out?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. How do you tap into that?
Yeah.
And what's beautiful in my experience, through the various, you know, path that I've been on, is that there are many entry points to it, many different entry points. And I think you have to really just open yourself first to the notion that you don't know what's going on. And then you have to sort of engage this sort of fundamental childlike curiosity to discover a new layer or dimension to reality that you might not have had access to ever, or that you just forgotten. I feel like all these things tend to be something we've forgotten, and the experience in my life has been when I have a big opening or insight, is like a sense of remembering, like I knew that, like this has always been inside of me.
Plato all the way.
Right, exactly. I've somehow forgotten. I've been blinded. I've been looking at shadows on a cave the
Yeah.
whole time. I never turned around and got to
Yeah.
see.
Yeah.
I'm curious, in your life, like, how do you engage with spirituality? Like, what are some ways in which over your life that you found a way to connect? Obviously, art is a big thing that helps you connect, but even outside of visual art, I'm curious, for you, like, how do you connect to the
Well,
spirit?
I have to tell you, I had a huge hit of Eastern philosophy when I was in Los Angeles, because at that time, a lot of the gurus were coming. Like, I was in a small lecture with Mahesh Yoga,
Wow.
and got initiated for free.
Transcendental meditation.
Mhm.
Wow.
And the initiation was another experience I'll never forget. It was just, I don't know, the chanting, and I was by myself with the initiator. The colors, the chanting, the scents, the whole thing. It was just marvelous.
Wow.
Then Swami Satchidananda, we went to a lecture,
Mm-hmm.
and afterwards there was a little event at a house, and we went to the house and we were meditating, and I opened my eyes, and he was levitating.
Wow.
He was like way up there, right?
Oh my God.
Oh God. And then a friend came in and said, "Hey, there's this guru in Beverly Hills, and he's got this big gong, and he gongs, and he just gongs you out of your body." Right? I was on LSD, but so started going to Yogi Bhajan, who
Mm-hmm.
started Kundalini yoga in
Mm-hmm.
the States, and he had just arrived, and he was teaching in the back of an antique store in Beverly Hills.
Incredible.
And I went every day for 2 years to those classes, and it's breath work,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So I remember I was on the beach on a swing, swinging away, and I heard these people down there saying, "Man, that girl's been swinging forever." And it was like I was doing breath work and just swinging along, and I didn't,
Wow.
so I had a really good base of
Mm-hmm.
yoga,
Yes.
and have subsequently done many different things,
Mm-hmm.
and meditation. I don't want to say, I do it and then I drop it, and then I do it and then I drop it, but I'm pretty, secure in my rituals,
Yeah.
and and within the last 5 years or so, I've been immersing in Rudolf Steiner,
Mm-hmm.
and that amazing material.
So much.
Yeah. So I would say I meditate 3/4 of the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a really great experience once. This was about 15 years ago, and I went, "God, what's in your third eye? What's in the third eye?" I closed my eyes, and boom, this being appears
Wow.
before me. A different reality. It was more real than this. It had light that could only be called, hyper, electronic blast of, whatever.
Yeah.
And that was pretty cool.
That's amazing.
Because to see the spiritual world and to see the astral world, you are totally changed.
100%. Yes.
100%, because it's not this reality. It's a different place.
It's woven into this reality, but it is not the same kind of experience that we're having right now. I mean, I can totally relate to everything that you're saying, because there isn't language to describe that experience. And I think that relates not only to like incredible spiritual experiences through meditation, or even just like spontaneous. Sometimes these things happen spontaneously, or even like in a lucid dream where you wake up in your dream and you're in a reality that feels more real than this one. Or in big psychedelic trips that people go on now. And they've been doing it forever. But in that experience, you're having the same sort of feeling when you come back, like that was more real than this. But how do I describe it? There's not a language or framework to describe it. Only way is you got to experience it. Like I can tell you about it all day, like the third eye opening and experiencing the spiritual light, of consciousness in that way. But unless you experience stuff, you can't understand it. Just like if I were to speak with a person who's been blind since birth, and I was the greatest poet who ever walked the planet, I could still never emit the experience of seeing the color blue to that person. I just couldn't do it. No matter how skillful I am with words, you have to see it for yourself in a sense. And I feel that's the same thing with these things.
I'm curious. I've never thought about this, but I know that with your eyes closed, you still see an awful lot.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if a blind person does see a lot.
I was using it more just as like an analogy or like a metaphor, but yeah, probably. You never know. Because people go on what's called like darkness retreats, where they are in dark, complete pitch black, not a pinpoint of light for many, many days. This in certain indigenous traditions, this is a big part of initiation for shamans. But you also see it in like Taoist traditions, the tradition of going on a darkness retreat. And from what I've heard about it, I've never done a darkness retreat, but that after a few days, it's like your spiritual eye wakes up and like you are seeing light and seeing things in different ways that you can't imagine. I know just that there's so much that's possible just based on the limited, tiny little swatch of experience I've had, like the tiniest little pinprick of experience that I've had through meditative states, through lucid dreaming, through psychedelic experiences, that there's just so much more going on than I could ever understand. And that to me invigorates me with like a sense of like, I don't know, lightness and a sense of like okayness. Some people, when they have that big awareness, it can be anxiety ridden, like the feeling of not knowing. But this is such a big not knowing that it's comforting.
Right.
I don't know how to describe that any more than that. So
right. No, we're pretty protected. I mean, we each have our little angels, and
yeah,
and whatever. Yeah.
Spirit guides, or you think about your ancestors. I think a lot about traditions who really emphasize the relationship to the ancestors and how important that is. I think about it a lot for myself. Like I think about just the miracle of like all the little things that happened in all of my ancestors' lives, like from, let's say, thousands of generations, like every decision that was made, every experience that happened, if there was a different thought or a different decision made somewhere along the way, I wouldn't be here. I'm a part of this miraculous chain of experiences in terms of I wouldn't be here embodied as Martin Benson in this way. I'd be somewhere else maybe. And so that miracle is so beautiful for me to contemplate, and this great chain of life, this great chain of being, and there's no separation. There's no accidents anywhere you look, even if they feel like an accident. Everything just feels so perfectly in alignment. But that's really hard to tell people when they're in the midst of suffering, when they're in the midst of real strife. And I think that's what also not only spiritual ground, but also art or various forms of expression can help give people a sense of how to move forward, through the trials of life. Because it's not all, love and light and rainbows and beautiful for people all the time.
Those are here and there experiences. A little bit of love and a little bit of rainbow. Mostly just strife.
It's tricky, but I feel like we're here learning things all the time. And the more we can find a sense of like humility in our own evolution, like I think and not take ourselves so seriously all the time. I think that's something I find to be really important as well. My mom used to tell me a lot growing up, or like even in my early 20s, like, stop taking yourself so seriously. And like, I feel like I'm finally starting to understand what she means in sort of like deeper ways, even if it wasn't her ultimate intention. But I think that's important too, like the humility of like not knowing, but the curiosity to like explore. And our materialist world is really a tough one, because it's sort of bending toward nihilism. And so people can get caught on that nihilist bent of meaninglessness. And that can really exacerbate sense of isolation and loneliness and depression. And so I look at art, especially spiritual art that is intentionally trying to touch to these spiritual places, as a refuge for people, as a way to point people beyond the trappings of materialist, nihilist, sort of hyper relative culture that we live in.
There's this other realm that has been posited, and I'm not sure if it's Steiner or who, the eighth sphere, which if a normal evolution is 7 spheres, but the eighth sphere, which is technological, drops out of that normal evolution and kind of is its own little corral. And it's kind of like, once you get in there, it's hard to get out, and a lot of kids I've heard, they don't want to take these desk jobs where you sit in front of a computer all day. They want to go farm or something.
That's great.
Is real, as opposed to the AI that we're entering into. I mean, these are really seriously problematic areas. And without that spiritual realm being available to us, it's scary.
It is. Like, I think like it's so funny with a lot of people who are into the virtual reality, like wearing these goggles. And when you see, I remember I went to the Van Gogh experience, this sort of traveling museum thing. I have my own critiques on it, so I don't want to bash it, because I think any kind of art experience is better than no art experience. But I remember when I was leaving, there were all these people like sitting in chairs with these AI goggles on, and it just felt so like creepy to me, and like kind of apocalyptic and odd. And this notion that we can replace the majesty of the living experience with a virtual one. There are novelties to it, and I can see applications to it in certain ways, but I am sort of very hesitant and also skeptical of the direction that AI and virtual reality and a hyper digital age might bring us to, especially without wisdom, especially without the wisdom of the spirit to guide us, because I don't know. It feels like it's turning into the movie, The Matrix, in some ways. And so I think we do need to counteract that. But I think a lot of people are feeling that too. I don't think what I'm feeling is sort of independent and on its own. Like people are wanting to get back into nature, wanting to ditch sort of the rat race and the cubicle and get into working with their hands, getting into the tangible world and getting into connecting with something that is real or seemingly feeling more real than these digital spaces that we've been brought up in.
No, absolutely understandable. And it's wonderful to see the sort of the museum world opening to everybody, and they becoming more and more and more popular, and crowded.
For sure.
Yeah. When I was growing up, or as a young adult, there were never people in museums. They were always empty.
Wow.
And now you go, the last time I was at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, I mean, it was sardine packed in the lobby. I kind of had to squeeze by people.
Yeah. I remember going there. It was like
a good
that.
sign, kind of, but
yeah, because people are looking for meaning. People are looking for a sense of understanding where we've come from, who we are. Like a lot of times we can understand who we are through our history. That's not the whole picture, but it can give us a beginning to have insight about who we are and our place in the world. And so that's what's kind of the funny paradox of these times that we live in, is that in a hyper materialist, consumerist culture that is dominating everything, people are looking more for meaning. You see people are looking more toward learning about philosophy or spirituality or engaging in art and going to museums and seeing shows. They're trying to understand, or even again in the sort of psychedelic renaissance that's happening with all the incredible results from the studies for trauma and PTSD and depression. It's amazing. People are having tangible spiritual experiences that change their life forever in a matter of hours. Like what they experience in a matter of hours is doing what no antidepressant has ever done. And so it's an amazing time. All these things are coming together. And on top of that, we're seeing the spiritual and art becoming more apparent, like we talked about with Hilma and her show. But then even just like I posted something on Instagram the other day with Artsy, and someone writing an editorial about the new generation of transcendental painters. And hell yeah, I was like so stoked. I made a post and I just tagged like as many artists as I could who are in that space or on the fringe of that space as I could. Just like, yes, like this is the time where we can have these conversations, where artists who are making this work can have recognition and have a sense of place within the art structures. So I just feel like it's an interesting paradox. We can see the rabbit hole of problematic experiences that come from AI and from materialism and consumerism and this very divisive age. But on the same end, we're seeing people more curious than ever about what's beyond. And that to me is exciting.
Well, what's kind of so fascinating is that spirituality, and there's a word that's even less acceptable, but it's related, morality. Morality is related to spirituality.
For sure.
And the object is a sort of, acceptance of other humans, or what they are and who they are. And I guess the idea is love. Love's a heavy word, but that is even less explored than spirituality itself. Morality. How do we just be nice to each other,
right?
And understand the next person, and that's kind of the key to spirituality too. We want to grow spiritually, we grow in our hearts.
Exactly. Yeah, ethically. That's why, like, even in like if we speak to like a philosophical tradition like yoga, we think of the 8 limbs of yoga before you even begin meditating, before you even begin pranayama, before you even begin asana, samadhi, all that stuff. You have to have an ethical framework first. First, no harming, no killing, no
Yep.
killing, no
Yeah.
stealing,
Yeah.
all these, there's an ethical framework. And for me, morality, it's like when you excavate all the layers of identity down to its core of just conscious living, breathing, feeling entity of life that's inside of us, that we're all the same, the universality, like beyond all the layers of identity and personal history, there is this essence of consciousness that is the evening of all playing fields. And when you can recognize that within yourself in a deep, intimate, authentic way, you begin to recognize it in everyone else, everything else. And it's just from that recognition that I feel, especially if it's really integrated within your whole being, you can't help but be moral. You can't help but want to be kind and loving and want to be of service to others. So I think that's really where we have to get to, is like first discover like what it is and who it is we actually are underneath all the layers of identity that have been given to us, or that we've received from birth. That to me is where the spirit ultimately will come from. So it's all there. So I think what you're saying, morality, is an interesting word to contemplate as well, like what it means in this world.
So, like, for instance, Kanye West started a religion or preaches or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then he spews hate. I don't understand towards certain elements.
Mm-hmm.
I don't get it. If yeah.
For me, it's and you've probably seen this a lot over the years, just being engaged in spiritual practice and spiritual circles, and even engaging in your own personal spiritual journey, you start to recognize the ability for the ego to hijack the spirit. And it's when the ego hijacks the spirit is where you get sort of that messianic complex, where you get the hyper narcissism, where you get the sort of type of behavior that you're speaking to. And so that is sort of like where spirituality, like, it has no wisdom to it in a way, because the ego has adopted it as its own. And I think anyone who's engaging in deep spiritual work, some of the first levels is really getting to know your own ego and its tendencies, and being able to dismantle the grip that the ego has. I think about the one of the most important texts in yogic and Vedic tradition, the Bhagavad Gita, and I think that's all about shifting the relationship with the ego, where the ego is not the master, but the ego is the servant to the spirit. And so you'll see that as well. And we're going to see more of that as people start to engage in psychedelics and spiritual practice. It's just a matter of, just because of the volume of people doing it, you're going to have people who don't have the right kind of guidance, particularly, and the ego will hijack the spirit and claim it as its own. So that's, to me, what I see with someone like Kanye West and the type of behavior you see there. Would you agree with that? Like,
I
what's your
think you're
experience?
absolutely right on there.
Mm-hmm.
But the dichotomy was so blatant. You can't preach the word of Christ and then hate people.
Mm-hmm.
You can't do that.
No, you can't. And
Yeah.
hopefully people are wise enough to see that. I mean, I think ultimately it will self-destruct, as we see what's happening with
That's the funny thing about evil. Apparently, evil just self-destructs over and over and over.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, what's also interesting is like this conversation within spirituality, and even you see a lot of artists talking about it in their work, is this notion of duality versus non-duality, and how these things are functioning, or the notions of relative versus absolute, and how these things are both working together. That's really important too, because we live in a dualistic experience. That's what sort of is the thumbprint of an earthly life, is duality. You're in it. You're in the dichotomy of all opposites, good and evil. That's a part of the learning that's here. But then within that space, there's a space that is enveloping that of the non-duality, where we see that these things go hand in hand. So ultimately, I think the evil does self-destruct over and over again. It becomes absorbed into the one. But that's not the world we live in. That's an experience you can have internally. But I think no matter what we do, this earth will be a realm of dualism. And we have to be able to grapple with that. And we have to be able to, in my opinion, we have to be able to find a way to live within the non-duality within our heart, within the dual framework. We have to bring that level of consciousness to our experiences, which is for me, it's a very hard path. I find myself falling on my face over and over and over again.
Right.
But like my mom said, don't take yourself so seriously.
Yeah.
Gotta laugh at yourself. Yeah. Well, this is this is an amazing conversation that we've had so far. I mean, we've been talking for like an hour and 10 minutes already.
Totally enjoyed it.
It's just flying by. And I think there's more for us to talk about too, as this starts to continue to grow. This movement of the spiritual and art is going to continue, I feel, to grow and grow and grow. I would love to have you back on the podcast at some point to talk and to be able to speak to more of what we see happening as this evolves. Because I think we're at the beginning. I think we're in the very beginning of this transition in the art world, and it's exciting.
As I was saying before, I am thrilled that there's this interest among your generation, because among my generation, you had to hide it. You really had to suppress that desire to explore and make public. So, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Barbara. Thank you for everything. I feel like you've been laying the groundwork for this. Like everything that's happening now is because of people like you who have been fighting in this space for so many years and been laying the groundwork and planting seeds, even though you might not have seen them sprout when you were at your height in New York, fighting this fight. Like they're sprouting now. And it's
my dear, I was in the closet.
Oh, well, I'm glad you're out now. And I'm just so grateful. I'm so grateful to get to know you in this way. And to, I know there's more to come between the two of us. So thank you so much, Barbara, for your time today. And we'll talk soon.
Blessings.
All right. Same to you.
Bye-bye.
Peace. Thank you all so much for tuning into this episode of Concerning the Spiritual and Art. If you like what we're doing here, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you can stay in touch and in tune with all the amazing offerings that we're going to be bringing to this channel. Thanks again for all your support. Super grateful, and excited to bring more content your way. Peace, y'all.